Good evening. I hereby call this March the 19th meeting of the Public Safety Committee to order. As always, we like to recognize those brave men and women who help our police, fire, emergency management departments, and the city of Winston-Salem to roll at large. So starting with our city staff, led by our city manager, Mr. Lee Garrity. I'd like to recognize our legal department, led by our attorney, Attorney Carmen. Attorney Sykes is usually always in the room as well. I'd like to recognize Chief Mayo, who is the chief of the fire department, and all the brave men and women of the fire department. Chief Thompson, who is the chief of police, and all the brave men and women of the police department. So thank you for what you do for our city. Members of the committee, there are 2 items on the consent agenda. Items on the consent agenda are unanimously approved unless one council member or committee member wishes to be pulled for further discussion or consideration. We have 3 items on the general agenda, which are all informational items. There's an item giving us an update on the Winston-Salem Police Department's school safety preparedness initiatives. We have an item giving us information regarding the homicides that have occurred in the city of Winston-Salem. And there's an item providing us with information regarding the history of the Vehicle for Hire program. Members of the committee, are there any items that should be pulled on the consent agenda for consideration? If there are none, I will consider a motion. The motion is properly seconded. All in favor of approving the consent agenda, please vote yes. Opposers, likewise. No. And Councilman Burke, I assume you are in favor of the consent agenda? Okay. So that appears to be unanimous. The consent agenda is approved. We'll move to item G1, please.
Item G1, Winston-Salem Police Department School Safety Preparedness Presentation.
All right, looks like queuing us up is our police chief, Chief Thompson. You have the floor.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I just wanted to share with you all some of the initiatives in light of what went on just recently in Parkland, Florida. Some of the safety initiatives that the Winston-Salem Police Department has been and will continue to implement and work in partnership with Winston-Salem Forsyth County School Administration on. Here today to present the presentation on school safety preparedness is our own Lieutenant Tom Peterson. He's the lieutenant over the School Resource Officers Program in our Educational Services Unit. Lieutenant Peterson.
Lieutenant Peterson, thank you, sir.
Good evening, committee.
Good evening.
Thank you for the opportunity to present. Recognize we have other items on the agenda, so I'll be brief in the presentation, but be honored to answer any questions you may have. Obviously, in light of the incident that occurred in Parkland, Florida on Valentine's Day, there's been a number of topics and discussions, obviously, on school safety across the country. And give you a little insight, brief overview of our schools and what we do as SRO program. There are 31 elementary schools in Winston-Salem. There are no SROs staffed in elementary schools. We are staffed in the middle and high schools. There are 12 middle schools in Winston-Salem and 15 high schools. Of that, you'll note that we serve the 12 in the high schools and 8 in the middle schools. A little misleading noted on the bottom bulletin, we actually have presence in all of the middle schools. However, 4 of those schools are combined middle and high school on the same campus. There are a total of 24 SRO staff. 20 of those staff are covering their individual assigned school, the SRO officers. 3 are roving corporals. If we have an SRO officer that is absent from school, they will fill in that place. When all SRO officers are available, they are present in rotating through the different schools in their district. There is 1 corporal that's assigned as a K-9 detection officer. That's to honor the contract request of the school system. Coordinated efforts. Each one of our SRO officers are familiar with the policies and procedures of their assigned school, and as this relates to lockdown drills. There are 2 types of lockdown drills or lockdowns the school system has. One is an intruder lockdown, which is what we all know as an active shooter, an active assailant wishing to conduct violence on a school campus. The second and more prevalent is a community lockdown. That's in any associated event that's near campus that could spill over to on a campus, but it's not necessarily directly related to trying to cause a threat or harm on campus. Each SRO officer participates in these lockdown drills and is very familiar so they can work in conjunction with their school staff to protect students. Active assailant training. What does law enforcement do to prepare for these type of situations? There's standardized state training that all law enforcement must adhere with or receive training on. At the Winston-Salem Police Department, all officers receive this annually. All SRO officers, since they're in a school environment which this has the frequency or possibly frequency to occur more often, receive that training twice in a school year. That training is done in scenario-based and it's done in an environment to replicate as best possible if there was a real-life situation. We coordinate that in the summer and Christmas break, so we have access to any one of the Winston-Salem schools. They work in cooperation with us, so this training is realistic to a school environment. Multi-agency first responder drills. One of the things that came to light several years ago is the necessity for law enforcement to train with first responders in the first responder community, fire, EMS, emergency management. We're fortunate enough within our jurisdiction to have been on the forefront of this, even nationwide. We've done joint training exercises with the Winston-Salem Fire Department, Forsyth County EMS, and Forsyth County Emergency Management. We've done that in a realistic-based environment. And we've done that in order to help prepare for the safe evacuation and medical treatment of students or staff that may be involved in an incident if it was ever to become a true or realistic incident that occurs. We're also fortunate enough to have two members of our agency, Lieutenant Bart Stone and Lieutenant Ed Branshaw, that have received a lot of additional training on active assailant. And they were instrumental and selected to a statewide committee that was instrumental in implementing this statewide training in North Carolina. When some of those changes were made several years back, they were on that committee and helped push to the forefront. So we're fortunate to have them in-house at our agency, and they've implemented a lot of the training we've been involved with annually. Here you see a photo of some of that real-life practical scenario training with Winston-Salem officers, members of the fire department, EMS. Building trust. One of the things we're fortunate to do in the SRO system and is our role, let alone just the safety of the school and the students, is to build that trust, build a relationship with staff and students. That's instrumental because if they trust our SRO officers, they're relaying information. And that information we get on the front end is the key in preventing one of these incidents before it actually happens. Obviously, the training aspect and the drills and scenarios we go through is a response. Ideally, any law enforcement community, any community, wants to be on the front of that and try to prevent it if possible. So we rely on that relationship and that rapport and the information we receive on the front end. So with that, we encourage our SRO officers and school staff to recognize change in behavior of students, to take seriously any reporting of an offense. So any rumored of a perceived threat is investigated to the fullest. We also look at it that this is community-based. This impacts an entire community. It's not just a school problem or a law enforcement problem. And you look no further than what you've seen on the media at Parkland, Florida to realize that. If an incident, catastrophic as we saw in Parkland, Florida, it impacts everyone. So we rely on a community to come forth, provide us information, details they are hearing, perceived threats that may be out in our community. And we also recognize that you can't just train one time for an incident and do one joint exercise or review annually and expect that to be enough. We rely on those partnerships, training repeatedly, and constantly being prepared so heaven forbid if that day does come, it's not the first time we've worked with other first responder agencies, that we are prepared to do the best we can to be prepared. That's a very quick oversight of a little bit of what we've done with the school system and lockdown preparation, as well as how we've trained as a law enforcement agency. Be happy to field any questions if you may have any.
Lieutenant Peterson, I start by saying thank you for the presentation. When I first came on the council, I remember that the SROs, the program was being administered by the Sheriff's Department. But, you know, no slight to the Sheriff's Department, but I'm very excited that the police department is inside of these schools. I have 3 kids inside the Winston-Salem County school system. I see the interactions are always positive. The feedback that I get is that people feel safe with you inside of the school system, and I haven't really heard anything derogatory or negative. So thank you for the work that you and the team are doing inside the police department. Are there any questions for Lieutenant Peterson?
Thank you.
Councilmember McIntosh, then Councilmember Lloyd.
I know it's pretty soon after the tragedy at Parkland, but is there any sense that we've got lessons learned from that? And I'm not talking about the nonsense harm in teachers. I'm talking about real, practical law enforcement opportunities to change our methodology or anything.
There is. Immediately following that incident, we immediately started meeting with principals at each school and reviewing the school plans and policies and procedures that are in place. And are we adhering to what we have in place, and is it a good plan, or is there a need to change things? So that's something that we do annually. The first week of August each school year, the SRO completes a school security survey, which is an in-depth several pages that they go and look at weaknesses of school security. And that can be an environmental through overgrown bushes or lighting, or it can be actually policy procedures as how we respond or the school system responds in a lockdown. So yes, we draw from all those previous experiences. Parkland's a little soon. I don't think we've seen the final studies of what could have or should have or best practices recommended from what's emerged from Parkland. But on our part, we immediately following that horrific incident, we've started reviewing our plans. That concluded last week, and we've shared those details with the school security director and Winston-Salem County School Administration so they will know our findings.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Councilman Larson.
I don't think anybody imagines having a live shooter in the school, but certainly the SROs are the front line now of expectations as far as security of that school goes. And of course we heard of disappointment in Parkland about the officers standing outside of the building and what have you. You know, what I'm curious about is that position of responsibility that is assigned to an officer. Could you elaborate a little bit on how officers are selected, volunteer? How long do they stay in that school? Are they rotated out every year? What is the relationship that's developed, and how long do we expect an officer to retain and develop those kinds of relationships in the school you're talking about?
Certainly. There is a selection process. We consider that a specialized assignment within our agency, so you must do a 2-year minimum on patrol before you can even be considered for that position. We do an interview process where we look at a work history or performance history within the agency. Probably more importantly is once an SRO is selected, we have a training protocol and established policies. So within the first year of that assignment, we work on getting them certified as a basic SRO officer. We send them to a SRO conference that provides them information, and we look and evaluate their performance in that new position. Obviously, it's beneficial to leave an officer in an assignment longer than a year in each school, because to build that rapport and trust that I alluded to in the PowerPoint takes time. You can't walk in and expect students and staff to trust you overnight. So that rapport is built over time, but we also look at how long an SRO may be in a school, and is it a time for a rotation as we bring new officers in? Is it opportunity for them to step in a new role into a school?
Mayor Pro Tem Burke.
Yes. When you talk about building trust, I know in one of the high schools, the officer, he would even referee games so that the students would get to know him and everything. And how secure are these schools?
We feel to secure. There are procedures in place and protocols are in place. And what we find, if those are adhered to, they are meeting to state standards, if not exceeding them. With the security assessments, we did find small things such as identification badges or making sure exterior doors are locked in the building. That's nothing new or earth-shattering for us as much as it is a reminder not to be complacent with day-to-day activities within the schools. So we were pleased in our findings of the security assessment when we went back and looked at procedures and protocols and the safety of our schools. And we think many of the minor deficiencies we've found are easily corrected.
I was going to mention so many doors they have at these schools. Now, all those doors locked, those from the side and the back. I know at some of the schools, when you walk in there, you have to take a picture.
Elementary.
They got you right over there.
Yes, ma'am. It varies from school to school. Elementary schools are under lockdowns with the airphone button that has to gain entrance. High schools are more difficult to secure in that fashion because high school students exit the main building and often go to pods or outside classes. So those are things we noted in the security assessment and made recommendations on how to do that safely to allow environments such as a high school where the students have to come and go with a little more freedom, but still hinder access to anyone that should not be on that campus.
Thank you.
Councilman Bessie.
Thank you. I remember in reading about the Parkland incident that it appeared, at least initially, that one of the ways the shooter there gained the system was that he knew it. He knew that pulling the fire alarm would override the lockdown protocols. Do you know if that's been confirmed by the additional review, and if so, if that's being taken into account, and how you coordinate what would happen in the case of a lockdown situation that appeared to coincide or be overridden by a fire alarm.
Correct. I do not know the confirmed findings out of Parkland yet, and it is my understanding of some of that information that, in fact, he may have pulled the fire alarm to facilitate his exit after the act of violence had occurred. We're still waiting for some of those final findings to be published. What I can tell you is just 2 weeks ago, we met with the fire marshal out of Forsyth County. We had a joint meeting on just that topic. What is the precedence on a lockdown versus a fire drill? And we worked through some of those issues and already started to facilitate some discussions. So if we saw that come into play here in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County schools, we're prepared for that and we know what action we would take.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Lieutenant Peterson, I'll follow up with one additional question.
Yes, sir.
It's my understanding that the Winston-Salem Forsyth County school system is partnering with technology companies to monitor, what students are saying online to give them a better depiction about how things might go inside of the school system in the event of emergency. How active is our Winston-Salem Police Department with partnering with the school system or other technology companies to keep an eye on what's been said online?
We have not got to that part in discussions with the school system. I know they were reviewing software and the capabilities of that technology, but we've not been brought into those discussions as yet as an agency. I predict that we will be when they get a little further along in that process of gauging how they wish to implement that into the school system. I see us being brought in, but to date, we have not yet.
Thank you, sir. Are there any additional questions for Lieutenant Peterson? We thank you for your presentation, sir.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Item G2, please.
Item G2, information regarding Winston-Salem homicides from January 1st, 2018 through March 11, 2018.
Chief Thompson, you have the floor, ma'am.
Good afternoon again. Just wanted to bring forth Lieutenant Mike Cardwell from our Criminal Investigations Division to give an update on our homicides. As you are aware, to date we have 7 homicides in our city, and Lieutenant Cardwell will further update you on where we are with those.
Thank you, Chief. Lieutenant Cardwell.
Good evening.
Good evening.
As Chief spoke, I'm Mike Cardwell. I'm a lieutenant in our Criminal Investigation Division, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you tonight about the homicide in 2018. I do have a short PowerPoint presentation we'll go through. As you can see from the map, we have the 7 homicides that occurred during 2018, and how they're geographically defined throughout the city and districts. Out of the 7 homicides that occurred thus far, as compared to 2 last year during the same time frame, detectives have been able to establish that there's no specific nexus between these cases. And there appears to be no reason as to why these cases would be related during investigation. Detectives have obtained arrest warrants for murder in 5 of the 7 cases being investigated, and did obtain a charge of assault with a deadly weapon inflicting serious injury with intent to kill in a 6th case. Out of those 2 cases that we do not currently have murder charges on, we do have strong leads, and I feel that we will be successful in those investigations. All of these cases, although we've made arrests, are active cases that are being investigated. Those cases, even after arrests are made, detectives still focus on those cases to prepare for prosecution. In 4 of the 7 homicides in 2018, detectives were able to establish that the victim and the assailant knew each other prior to the incident, and that the event spawned out of the relationship. In the other 2 homicides that occurred, it appears that those occurred as a disagreement between 2 individuals. They weren't random acts, and there was still some type of connection between the assailant and the victim. Detectives, continue to work on these cases that are unsolved. As you can see here, you have the dates of each case with the victim's name and their age and location for each of the 7 cases. One of the cases that are indicated as solved, which was February 22nd, which was 26-year-old Tanisha Mills. We have the arrest that was in out of state for the assault with a deadly weapon inflicting serious injury. Just in an effort to try to help stop these crimes from occurring before they do, We do know that from past examination of crimes that violent individuals tend to continue to commit violent crimes. So in an effort to try to stop those future crimes, we do work hand in hand with our federal and local partners in trying to identify those violent offenders, those chronic offenders, and try to seek the longest, strongest terms we can for sentencing on those cases. Also, hand in hand with that, we have what's known as a violent offenders notification, where we meet with individuals that have committed violent crimes and basically put them on alert. We're watching. You need to stop committing those crimes, and we offer resources to help them go away from the violent crimes, whether it be community resources with education or community resources with counseling, things to help them. In addition to that, we also know that really to prevent future violent crime, early intervention is needed. So that means that community partnerships with our youth, specifically at-risk youth that have already committed some type of crimes, that we have opportunities to reach out to them, bring them to the community, bring them to mentors, adults in the community that will put them on the right path, keep them from going down violent paths, such as some of our youth outreach programs that we do with the sports programs, some of the other items that are outlined in our pamphlets, which I have a copy of. And that's a basic overview of the cases. They are currently still under investigation. I do have some basic breakdown about the cases, each individual case, to get questions about it, but I'm happy to try to answer any questions you have.
And Lieutenant Cardwell, if you can just sort of repeat what you said about the 7 homicides. It's my understanding that out of the 7, there are 0 cases where the victim and the assailant didn't know each other. It's generally a relationship between the two. We always like to point that out because we want the citizens of this city to feel safe and not think that it's just a wild, wild west experience and people are running around. I mean, one homicide, one person dying is one too many. We always say that. But it's important to bring that aspect out. So if you just elaborate on that a little bit more, please.
Sure. And I agree with you. One homicide is concerning. And when we have this many homicides there in this type of time frame, it is unusual. But it is important to note that out of the investigations that we've had, out of the 7 that have occurred, we've been able to show that out of 4 of the 7 homicides, detectives were able to determine that the victim and the assailant, the offender, knew each other prior to the homicide. So they knew each other, they were aware of each other, and it evolved out of their relationship. And on the other 2 homicides, it appears that there was a possible disagreement between the 2 that erupted prior to the homicide. So it wasn't a random act that someone just went around and looked to try to commit a violent act. There was some type of argument that evolved and it escalated into a violent act.
Thank you, sir. Mayor Pro Tem Burke.
Yes, I don't think we can emphasize that enough. A lot of times when people hear about people getting killed and it's, oh, this city is getting to be bad, I say no. It's people who know each other that the police department has no control over. I say it's like you and I are friends, and we could be right in the same place. We start arguing, and then one of us going to use a gun or something on, and that's how it happens. The police cannot control that. We can just pray and hope that people will learn how to get along better.
And I agree, and I think that's where that or that early intervention with education, with our youth especially, to learn how to de-escalate arguments, not having to be violent, but actually learn how to talk to each other, and those early intervention programs with our youth and even the chronic offenders, the violent crimes, VCTF operations that we do, where we go out, talk to the youth, try to intervene early and get them down the right path. It's important that we take those actions.
Yeah, Pro Tem.
And a man gave a story, and he said that he was asked to come to school, to go to the school. And when he got to school, the teacher told him, your little boy uses improper words. He knocks over the chairs. He's rude to the students. And the father went back and evaluated himself. He said, that's the way I act. That's why my son was acting that way. And this man became a minister because he said he had to change the way in which they were living in their home if he wanted his son to grow up to be a positive, productive person. And I think more of that. And the teachers do work with children, but a lot of them are not getting that help from home. If you and I talk loud, or if we can't solve a problem unless we say something wrong to each other, or we're ready to use a knife or a gun, then that's what the children will do. So the schools try, but parents and churches are going to have different types of activities also to help change. And I thank you for that information.
Yes, ma'am.
Councilman McIntosh.
We've been seeing a trend after a dip in, was it 2015, where our homicide rate was way down, and we've been inching back up over the last several years, 2012. And that seems to have been tracking national trends. Does this reflect the national trend? Are the statistics from other metro areas?
It's hard to predict a lot of these crimes because these are unique individual violent acts. We know that in our community, the crimes that we've had here are specifically, usually there's a known victim and offender relationship. We don't have the crimes where you have just random acts of violence that they can't identify or geographically bound homicides like we can have nationally in some cities. But with us specifically, it's a little unusual for this year that we have 7 homicides during this time frame. But to be able to correlate a Y factor, I mean, these are very unique situations, and I know that we can predict our yearly amount of homicides by this short period of time. They are specifically unique to each other. Now, as far as the last couple of years, in 2016 we had 24 homicides total for the year. 2017, 26 for the year. Early on, we only had 2 during both those years during that same time frame. But it's hard to predict what our outcome will be based on the early incident.
But are we seeing a national trend that mirrors what's going on in our community? Are homicides up significantly across the country?
I don't think when you compare our community, I don't think that we are the same as in other communities around us. Not to start comparing the communities around us, but I think we are at the lower end of our shared communities of homicides. I'll be glad to get that information specifically.
Yeah, I'd just like to see the trend. Mm-hmm. And then the other question is there pretty good consistency in the weapons used in these homicides?
I can give you the weapons for this year specifically. Out of these cases, there were 4 handguns used, 1 rifle that was used, 1 personal weapon, which would be your hands, and 1 blunt object, which would be just a heavy, large object.
And is that a typical ratio?
Again, I can get those specific statistics for you. I'll prepare something and forward it to council.
And to put things in perspective, in Charlotte, it's my understanding that they had 25 homicides by the second day in February. I know the population is much denser, but I think our police department does a great job considering the size of the city, the population, so we must always keep that in perspective as well. So if we can, Councilmember Larson, Councilmember Bessie, then we'll come back to Mayor Pro Tem Burke.
Thank you for this briefing, and I think the public is always anxious to know what's going on. Fatalities, are only a part of our police landscape, basically, and I guess what I'm curious about is armed robberies, use of weapons, people that are shot and go to the hospital and are listed as critical condition or not life-threatening, but they've been shot anyway. That represents this sort of gun violence that we are experiencing. Do we have, or can you provide, and I think you do this anyway, some statistics on those kinds of crimes that we're dealing with in this first quarter? I know we do house break-ins and car break-ins and all this other thing, but when we're dealing with violent crime, such as robbery or house break-in, armed robbery, as it were, do we have statistics that would reflect that as well as fatalities?
I don't have those statistics here today.
Yeah, I don't expect them today. I know you keep them, and I think as we look at the landscape of trying to provide a safe environment, what is actually going on in this city beyond the 7 sensational deaths that we all regret? But there's another aspect of day-to-day living that we all sort of worry about. Is it safe, for example, for me to walk from Harris Teeter to my car, or is it likely that I'm going to get robbed in the parking lot, and that does not show up as a fatality? So I think as we look at the question of landscape of crimes committed, how safe is this community, and asking the same questions that Councilmember McIntosh is asking, as we look at comparative cities and what have you, are we looking at national trends, below national trends, sort of standard operations increase problems, decrease problems. I know we have an excellent police department, and for example, the actions that they took recently at the mall in containing problems is an excellent example of how well our police are trained. But you can't stop every event that occurs. But I think people are interested in knowing what the density of those events are.
Chief Thompson.
Councilmember Larson, we will get those stats for you and have those available to you. What I do want you to know is that we're constantly working with, because we understand if we can identify the individuals involved in robberies that have a high propensity robberies, perhaps we can prevent some homicides, because in some of the more violent robberies, they do escalate or could escalate to homicides, and we want to do everything we can to prevent that. Some of the other things that we're doing as an agency, we have, as you know, longstanding relationships with our other local, state, and federal agencies, and just recently we've met with our U.S. Attorney, the new U.S. Attorney for the Middle District, Martin, U.S. Attorney Martin, came to Winston-Salem and actually offered assistance in a number of different ways. So we'll continue to work with him and one of his assistants, Rob Lang, that we've had a couple decades of working with him and our relationship with him on a very, very close basis. So we'll continue those things. And so it's not just about identifying them, apprehending them, but it's also making sure we remove them from our community for a very long time. That's our ultimate goal when we get to that point. So we'll continue to do those things. And just next week, we have a meeting scheduled with one of the supervisors from the alcohol, tobacco, and firearm, where we're going to discuss some of the people that we've already identified in our community as being violent offenders with using weapons, namely handguns, and working with them to give them the most time that we possibly can. So we'll continue to do those things, to do whatever we have to do to keep the citizens and the streets of Winston-Salem safe.
If I can follow up, I think that's excellent, and I don't want to forecast gloom and whatever here. The proactive approach that your department takes at a variety of levels, whether it be in the school, Easter egg hunts, coffee with the cops, all the things that you're doing to engage the community on regular and develop that confidence will pay off. Will pay off. But and I don't want to look at statistics of 7 people being killed in this city as an indicator that we are the Wild West. We're not. But I am curious about trying to keep everything in perspective of the bigger picture. And I applaud your intervention and your preemptive action to try to address those problems before they surface into the public newspaper.
Thank you. And you've opened the door, so I'm just going to walk on through it for you. You mentioned some of the initiatives, namely Coffee with a Cop, and some of the other initiatives that we've done. As you all know, today we had the pleasure of having members of the Department of Justice, Office of Justice programs here in Winston-Salem to do a pilot training program with members of our agency as well as members of our community leaders. And we assembled today at Bridger Field House and had very, very good dialogue. But I have to tell you, and this is going to be a pat on the back to our community, and I'm going to quote, and I told him I was quoting him. One of the members from the Justice Department said, Winston-Salem Police Department is pretty exceptional compared to other law enforcement agencies across this country.
I certainly think so.
And he was basing that on the initiatives, the research that they had done on our community, which was part of the reason why they chose us to do this pilot program. But as we're going through the training, and I think if they're watching, they will totally agree, we realized quickly that we could have been the trainers delivering that training. That's how far ahead of the curve we learned that we were compared to other agencies across the country. And as a result, not just of that, but as the work that we've been doing, we've been invited to have a seat at the table at a symposium this week in Birmingham, Alabama. And during that symposium, I will speak specifically on initiatives that the Winston-Salem Police Department are doing and have been doing for years. And the idea is to share. It's called Building Trust and Legitimacy, Lessons Learned in the Field. And this is, I've worked with Marketing and Communications, who's done a fabulous job with us with putting together a book that actually identifies, illustrates, and discuss the initiatives that we've been doing for decades and continue to do here in Winston to share with other law enforcement agencies. The Detroit Police Chief will be there, the Chief of the Dallas Police Department, Houston Police Department, and Winston-Salem will be at the same table. I'm very proud of that.
That's
Here,
why
here.
you're chief.
Here, here.
That's why
Thank
you're
you.
chief.
Councilman Bessie, thank you, Chief.
Thank you. With the committee's indulgence, I have several questions along these lines, if I may.
Well, let's do this. If you have several questions, we'll go to Mayor Pro Tem Burke, and we'll come back to you and give you the floor.
Yes. I've said to this city manager, we have one of the best police departments. We've never held back on making sure that they feel that they can move forward to make this a police department that we're proud of. Not long ago, Mr. Page, you sent a letter somewhere for me. Didn't you? Oh, it's the chief?
Yeah.
All right. And it talked about these accomplishments because I have said we do not talk enough about ourselves. We've all, as the chief has said, we've been out front. And I say that we're fortunate with the unemployment, the underemployment, with the poor working poor, that we're not having any more of these robberies and the kinds of things that you mentioned, Mr. Larson. But I want to tell you, I'm proud of this police department. And when I go back and I look at our history, where we came from, and how we had elected officials who felt that we wanted to have a good police department, and there were certain things that we needed to do. And we've done them, and you all have accepted them and moved forward. And we're proud.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Bessie, are your questions directed towards Lieutenant Carwell or Chief Thompson?
Probably a combination.
Okay, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. Thanks very much for your presentation so far. Very detailed and helpful. We appreciate it. To follow up first on a line of inquiry about the weapons used and the expansion that Councilmember Larson suggested on looking at other gun-related crimes in the community. I think it would be helpful to me to have breakdowns on how many gun-related crimes there were, and how many you were able to identify the weapon used, and any notable characteristics about the weapons used, including in how many cases was it a weapon that was legally in the possession of the suspect or perpetrator, and in how many cases it was illegally obtained, and if we have any sense of how that is coming to take place. But if not, just the raw numbers on how many were legally purchased and how many were, sort of street buys kind of thing. And generally speaking, I know that part of what we try to do with this kind of presentation is get a better understanding of what we can do to help support successful programs and provide with the resources you need to expand or continue those. Another thing that we try to do here is what can your information help us understand about the sources of the problems that you're ending up dealing with. So, and my questions are a combination. Going back to the 7 homicides, you indicated that 4 were with handguns and 1 was with a long gun.
A rifle.
Rifle.
Yes.
Have you identified the type of weapon in that case?
Yes.
What kind of rifle was it?
It was a 22 caliber rifle.
Okay. And with regard to the homicides on a different line of inquiry, I know because I read your summaries that you send around that at least one of these appeared to, it was almost certain to have taken place involving intimate partners, domestic related incident.
Yes, sir.
And that was the one that I know about was the one in Charleston Court.
Yes, sir.
Were there any others that appeared to involve domestic partners or intimate relation partners?
That's our only domestic violence
Okay.
related.
All right. Do you know whether in that case there were any prior restraining orders?
Not that the investigation has found so far. It was an early on relationship. It was not a long term.
Okay. All right. Very helpful. In the others, do you know, and if I'm asking detail that goes too far into the investigation, let me know and I'll shut up, but did any of the relationships or the interactions appear to be gang related?
There's no indication that any of these cases were gang related.
Do you know if any of them appeared to involve drug transactions?
We have at least one case that's still ongoing investigation. That is one investigative direction that we are looking at, but nothing that we've established.
Okay. What about other illegal transactions? You indicated that 4 of them had prior relationships. 2 of the incidents were associated with a disagreement, on the spot, I guess, as it were. So, other illegal transactions, illegal gambling, or something. Okay.
Nothing that we've uncovered as of yet.
And any other, to an extent that's already been raised, but any other trends or patterns over the longer period of time, the last couple of years, in sort of source or origins of the conflicts that resulted in a homicide?
I have strong knowledge of this year and last year. I'd have to go back and look at anything comparative, but there's nothing that appears to be a pattern of action. So there's not a group or an area that's geographically defined where you would have for like gang violence. It's something that you brought up. Each one of these cases appears to be specific. Now, last year we did have a double homicide that was a domestic relationship. That was a stagecoach investigation that was done. But as far as a relationship to any of these cases, there doesn't appear to be any kind of a relationship where you would identify a pattern of why these homicides would occur. They appear to be unique investigations that are between the offender and the victim.
So one thing we might look for example, in sort of the overview of what do we need to work on in terms of a broader society problem, if there were a pattern increase in drug transaction-related crimes. But you're not seeing that.
Those are things that we do look at while we're investigating these crimes and trying to establish the specifics as to why the crime occurred. We look at multiple investigative directions. So we do look at whether there's a gang nexus, whether there's a drug nexus, those type of things. But there doesn't appear to be a clear pattern of behavior that you could say this drug is causing this or this gang group is making this happen. Everything appears as though these are unique cases that they're not specifically, they don't specifically have a nexus to.
All right, thank you. Chief, I think sort of a longer-term question would be applying that to longer-term trends. If you have cumulative data over the last several years you could provide for us that might illuminate that question, that would be
We can certainly get that information for you.
right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bessie. Lieutenant Cardwell, if I were going to give an award out tonight for somebody who walked right up to the line, told it, and didn't cross over, you get that award, sir. Fine job. Fine job. Any other questions, Mayor Pro Tem Burke? Oh, gold stars for everyone. It's from the teacher and the counselor over here. Gold stars for everyone. Chief Thompson.
Thank you, Chair Taylor. I just want to, before we end, to acknowledge my staff here tonight, if you would. Assistant Chief Natasha Miles, Assistant Chief Wilson Weaver, Assistant Chief Scott Bricker, Captain Chris Louder, Captain Steve Tolley, Lieutenant Tom Peterson, I think he has left.
Yes.
Lieutenant Mike Cardwell that you've just heard from, and of course Officer Paul Felsky. Very proud to have them all on my team. Thank you.
That deserves a round of applause. Thank you for what you do. Thank you, Chief. Members of the committee, in the interest of time, we have one more item.
Can I just say one thing?
You may say whatever you want, Mayor Pro Tem.
Captain Louder, as I stated, did a very good job when they were talking about the Haynes situation. He was very calm. Sometimes when we talk about things, if we're calm, then the public takes it in a calm way. And he let us know that the police department was in full control. That was good comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. Item G3, please.
Item G3, information regarding the history of the Vehicle for Hire program. This item was continued from the January and February meetings of the Public Safety Committee.
Right. I know most of us are pretty much up to speed on the Vehicle for Hire program. This was in committee last month. We wanted to hold this particular item because I know Councilmember Larson had taken a particular interest in getting additional information. So, Councilmember Larson, instead of going into the presentation, are there any direct questions that you might have for staff regarding the Vehicle for Hire program?
No, I think the main thing I was interested in is the regulatory aspect of inspections and quality control of that particular function on city streets, and particularly in view of the rise of Uber and other transportation systems that the public is using to sort of differentiate what the city can do and what the city can't do within those various two categories of public transportation. That's the current thing. I was interested in the history, very interesting history. Thank you for pulling that together. But on an applied basis today, and every year we permit these things, you know, and the question always arises, why are we doing that, and why does Uber not have to be permitted, and whatever. So I was just curious as to trying to get those clarifications of what the city's responsibility actually is when it comes to taxi cab quality control and enforcement.
Yes. Good evening, council members.
Good evening.
Department of Transportation. We have our Vehicle for Hire program. You're well aware of it, and we provide oversight to our taxis and limousines, horse-drawn carriages, golf carts, and soon to be probably trolley pubs. One of the things that we do, among a lot of things, is we conduct vehicle inspections yearly. In most cases, quite more frequently than yearly. In the spring and the summer, we inspect every vehicle and every fleet. As new cars are brought on, we re-inspect those vehicles, and as new businesses are brought on board, we inspect those vehicles as well. If we see cars that look to be maybe not as best of condition, we contact the business owner. The business owners are ultimately responsible for the cars. We contact them, tell them what the code is, remind them of what they need to do, and they need to bring that vehicle to us to have it checked out. And if it's not up to par, then it needs to be removed from service. One of the challenges that we hear a lot from our local taxi companies is, what about Uber? What about Uber? You know, Lyft and Uber, the rideshare services. 3 or 4 years ago, the major companies in town would tell you we're not worried about those folks. Well, I believe they are now. But state law that was put in place before those companies came into North Carolina that says that the municipalities did not have the authority to regulate those companies at all. So we have no authority over them, and we can't do anything about it.
Okay. So complaints. How many complaints do we handle, say, from the taxi cab control? Are we the source of receiving those complaints?
Yes, right? We are. Surprisingly, not a lot of complaints. Typically, maybe 1 or 2 every couple of months. Most folks, they develop relationships with the cab drivers. They know each other, and usually those issues are resolved before it gets to us. And if it does get to us, then we work with the cab company to address it.
Right. And what is the fee structure that cabs pay to the city on an annual basis?
Well, the drivers of cabs get yearly driver's permits. There's a $10 cost for that. Other than that, there's no other cost for the vehicles.
So the cost of the inspections and handling complaints and all of that, which the city absorbs, is that covered by those fees?
No, there's no fees that cover the inspections or the person who oversees the program.
Okay. All right. No other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. McIntosh.
But there's a registration fee, right?
Well, the vehicles are registered with the state of North Carolina. They have tags they have to get, but there's no fee that...
No local.
No local fee, no.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Ring?
Thank you.
Mr. Ring, you got out pretty easy today. Thank you. All right, members of the committee, our consent and general agenda items have been completed. Is there anything else that we should discuss or that should be considered for the good of the order at this time? Mayor Pro Tem Burke is recognized, so we'll recognize the city manager, Mr. Garrity.
Thank you, Chairman Taylor. Just wanted to remind the committee as well as the public that we start on Wednesday a series of 9 community meetings to talk about the potential list of capital needs for a possible bond referendum in the fall. The first meeting is Wednesday at 6 p.m. at Carl Russell Recreation Center on Carver School Road. The second meeting is on Thursday, 6 p.m. at Haynes Hosiery Recreation Center, and there are meetings following the next 2 weeks after that. We look forward to lots of input from the public.
And Mr. Garrity, I know we're doing our best to get in mailboxes. We're doing our best to advertise online with newspaper companies, with whoever we can get to let the citizens know. We're doing it on TV 13. Are there any other measures you might want to mention? Because the one thing we might get is, how do we know? We didn't know. So
we sent a mailing out to all registered addresses in Winston-Salem. A little postcard went out that listed all of the locations, all 9, because even if you can't make the one that's close to you, you can go to another one. We have done ads in the newspapers, as well as the big thing we're pushing is social media as well, where we can try to target individuals to encourage them to come. We posted the information in the libraries. We're also working with the community assistant liaisons on specific targeting within each ward.
Yeah, Pro Tem Burke.
At church Sunday, the pastor read the announcement about Carver. The care that I have, I've asked to send to all of the churches, make sure they know what's going on.
Thank you. So, Mr. Bessie, Councilman Bessie.
One question, and it arose out of the homicide report, but it's actually one that I've been concerned about for a while, and it's an inquiry. I know you don't have the data here, but I would be interested over the past year or so if you could get us statistics on how many of the armed robberies, shooting incidents, I think at least 1 or 2 homicides occurred at one of the video sweepstakes institutions. I know I keep seeing those reports come over. There was an armed robbery at this place. There was a shooting at that place, and wanted to get some numbers, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bessie. If there is nothing further, seeing that there's nothing further, for the good of the order, we'll consider this meeting to be adjourned. Thank you.